Bergson and the holographic theory. We're looking at information in biology, somewhat a continuation of number 69. Or what is communication? Or how do you communicate bioform, the creation of beings, structures, forms? What is language, the basis of communication? Well, it's all way different. Information. Normally the schema is as such. In the DNA lies all the information to build a frog. So consider this a part of the previous discussion, number 69, and the current state of this omnipresent concept is information everywhere. In 69, we get to study the concept of neuroscience, or information in the brain. And what we saw, the base Shannon schema, transmitter, channel, receiver, any applicability to perception and consciousness is now being questioned. And the problems on analysis lead us to Bergson's model of perception. We're taken there. This time, we'll view the state of information in biology. But we'll see, information is a metaphor for communication. And the most familiar form of this is language. But understanding language, well, we're very far from this. We discussed this in number 9, especially number 31. So we're very far, in fact, from understanding the base of the information metaphor. It's way different than current science believes. Again, we're carried back to the hard problem and to perception. And now we'll see to Bergson's very different model of language, which in fact stems from his model of perception. Again, my grad student correspondent pointed me to another neat article in Information. This one by Johann J. John, who's a PhD in neuroscience, assistant professor, still I think, at Boston University. The article appeared on the site 3 Quarks Daily in 2015. This one, how informative is the concept of biological information? In this, he looks seriously at the base of this central metaphor of information in biology. Right there, information. It's a central metaphor with which to talk about the nature of life and mind. John had preceded this with another piece, the difficulties of fully applying the information model to DNA. Just a little article here. If the DNA molecule is a book of life, it is a very strange book indeed. Let's set up the difficulty, a very quick summary of this first one on the book of life. A fleshed out version of the life as information metaphor as John describes it. Each DNA molecule is a book or molecular hard drive, a physical store of abstract symbols that can be quantified as bits or bytes of information. The abstract symbols are the nucleotides. The letters are the genetic code. Each DNA book contains 2 copies of the same exact information, since each nucleotide pairs with a complementary nucleotide. Each chromosome is a volume in the genetic library of the cell's nucleus. This library constitutes the organism's genome, so a library of genetic information. Now this transmission genetics, that is how genetic information from the parental DNA library is remixed as a new half-size library in the sex cells. How the parental libraries are combined in fertilization, and how the new library in the offspring is copied during each of its cell divisions. And then developmental genetics, which is how the information is read out by the cellular machinery in order to create more useful machinery, in other words, how to build an organism. So we start with transmission, a simplified version thereof. Imagine the DNA books are long scrolls, and the scrolls are divided down the middle. Each side of the scroll is a complement of the other. If in a binary code, the left side has a 0, the right side has a 1, and vice versa. During replication, the 2 halves of the scroll are slowly torn apart. Free 1s and 0s take up positions in a new copy and are brought thereby or nearby by the DNA polymerase. The DNA polymerase is the photocopier, the free nucleotides, the copier ink. So understanding transmission genetics does not depend on any understanding of how genetic information is read out or decoded, no more than a copier understands. This is simplified, but it gets much more complicated when gene expression is factored in. Gene expression, that is how things are built from the information in the scrolls. That is, in other words, developmental genetics. In other words, this bullet. Developmental genetics, gene expression can, to an extent, follow the same book framework. For example, during transcription, RNA polymerase enters the genetic library and notes down a message from one of the recipes in one of the DNA volumes. This message, the mRNA, everyone's heard of that now, is then sent outside the library to the ribosomal workshop. So off it goes. At the workshop, the words that comprise the message are called out one by one. Each one corresponds to one component, one amino acid. The transfer RNA brings the right component at the right time and is then attached to the previous component. In this way, a protein device is manufactured from amino acid components. But there must be more to it. Problem 1, the diversity of cell types. If all cells originate from a single fertilized egg cell, then they are all genetically identical. How then do the various cell types arise? For example, imagine that a multicellular organism is like a city. The cells correspond to different sorts of buildings. The first room in each building is always a library. This is crucial to the construction of other rooms. But on its own, the library cannot determine what the final building will look like, because it always contains the same books. Someone has to read the books and decide what kind of building to create. Problem 2, the 3D topology problem. A human cell's DNA is around 2 meters in length. It's very tightly packed, and the nucleus is only 6 micrometers wide. It is not just scrunched up in a structureless tangle. It folds and coils into structures that help determine which genes are active and which are inactive in a given cell. One such structure is the DNA loop. And a recent study found about 10,000 such loops. Each loop is formed when stretches of DNA that are far apart on a chromosome are brought together by specific kinds of protein. The scrolls rearrange themselves depending on context, folding up like origami to create all kinds of three-dimensional forms. A result of the overall developmental trajectory of the organism, a trajectory itself is not immune to events outside the organism. So the meaning of a book typically does not depend on its three-dimensional topology. A computer program would be rather difficult if the symbols could mean different things in subtly different contexts. That is, if the code could be three-dimensionally structured, and everything depended on what the structure looked like. At the end, John noted the arbitrariness of symbols. Coffee, for example, the word is certainly not the physical liquid. There's no necessary physical connection to the word coffee and the actual liquid. He wondered if the info metaphor only goes so far, if things are way more physical, to quote. But perhaps developmental genetics and genomics and epigenetics and biology more generally will be better served by Waddington's more grounded metaphor. Marbles rolling down a hilly landscape. The marbles are not words to be translated, but real physical objects whose trajectories are influenced by all the processes that are currently ongoing, from the texture of the surface it is rolling on to the subtle movement of the air. So very physical, marbles rolling down a hill. And this led to the next piece that we started with, his musing on information itself as a central metaphor. We start with this statement with respect to the earlier concept of information, that is pre-Shannon in the computer. The quote, when something is informative, it creates a specific form or structure in the mind of the receiver, something that is presumably useful. What he acknowledges here, what's needed, even to understand the transmission of information, quote unquote, via language, which is our base, implicit model of what information means, we need a model of linguistic understanding, but we currently have none, certainly not via AI. Again, see number 31. He notes, the sheer familiarity of communication may induce us to overestimate our understanding of it. Indeed, this would require a solution to the hard problem, which itself is the problem of perception. And again, how we see the coffee being stirred out there. It is already a specification of information, just that vision of the coffee cup out there. Let's follow this through. I state the sentence. The gal stirred the coffee with a spoon. The linguistic string we can call a structured modulating device. Structured modulating means with its word or subject, verb, object, preposition, object, in this case, conventional syntactic structure. Stirred the coffee with the object, a spoon. It is employed to firstly redintegrate experience. Note that event, as we said several times, is an invariant structure. Velocity flow fields, adiabatic ratios, inertial tensors, acoustic invariants, etc. And the event structure sends a wave, a resonant wave, through 4D experience in this Bergsonian model. So it's intended first to reintegrate the experience of coffee stirring and move the mind/brain into the perception mental of an event. That is the stirring of coffee by an agent, an event defined via its structure of invariance laws. Everything starts then with the theory of perception, how the event is perceived, the origin of the image of the external world, how the event is perceived in the first place. And then I'd bring up again the standard Bergsonian model we've discussed many, many times in matter and memory. In this case, in the Bergsonian world, we have a holographic field, and the brain is a reconstructive wave passing through this field, specific to the cup and the fly at a scale of time, not creating an image in the brain, the image being right where it says it is, in the external field, not within the brain, which starts a whole different theory of perception, memory, cognition, and therefore language. So without a theory of perception, there can be no theory of cognition or linguistic understanding, nor any true understanding of our base, intuitive model of information, which implicitly lies beneath, that is provided in hidden meaning or sense for the whole information metaphor. So if we start with an entirely different base for perception, we're going to have a quite different model of linguistic understanding, therefore of communication, therefore of information. This perceptual experience with its invariance laws is equally the knowledge that lets us design or create devices, like mousetraps, as we've noted. We're creating a device, a mousetrap, from a set of components, strings, boxes, toothpicks, cheese, etc. In this case, creating a crossbow-like mousetrap. Or even more simply, we can use an orange peel to stir the cup of coffee. Why? Because we understand that an orange peel will satisfy, that can be successfully inserted into and support the dynamic structure of coffee stirring, that is, those invariance laws, moving the liquid with a certain force, etc., necessary to achieve the same result, that is, liquids mixed, the cream and coffee. Remembering that these invariants exist only over an indivisible flow of time, that is, we're not in the classic metaphysics of space and time. But as just noted, even this simple orange peel transformation is already designed and involves the information supporting design. And important, this applies whether, one, you're attempting an AI program to do design, or trying to explain a biological or evolutionary program, which is, say, reusing some biological component as in a flagellar motor to do design. The information metaphor employs and rests on the same base, the theory of conscious perception, whether in neuroscience, cognitive science, or biology. So the above is just an amplification of this statement in John. To quote, information theory was able to revolutionize the mechanical external aspects of communication, in part by ignoring meaning and content. Explanations of genes or neurons that refer to information processing are therefore leaving out the most important part of the story, how information that has been successfully communicated becomes manifest in its structure and in the behavior of the recipient cell or organism. So note this, that last line, how this information becomes manifest in the structure and behavior. We're back to the instinct problem. That is the vision or the function of the behavior, building a web or paralyzing a caterpillar, is integrally linked in the creation of form. That is, the spider was constructed as a device to build webs. Already this was part of the design. Remember the complexity of this web. In human equivalent, we've got two trees, 90 feet, 100 feet tall, 300 feet apart. The equivalent of a mile of rope being used, 5,000 feet of rope, always designed, tailored to the specific condition involved with the trees, the configuration of the bushes, etc. So extremely complex behavior, but somehow being carried in supposedly this DNA structure, because the baby spider can do this instantly when first born. So how is the complex knowledge required to build a web stored in DNA for a baby spider? We're back to the instinct problem. Structure, function are inseparable. So as though transmitting a sentence describing this, the man stirs the coffee, or the spider spins a web, or the wasp stings and paralyzes the caterpillar in the 9 places required to do it. Or I'll make a mousetrap that works like a crossbow. Here, the last sentence, I've communicated a plan to create a device via an analogy based in the mapping of perceived events. Mapping the crossbow to the mousetrap. So continuing, he says, in other words, if information is to become truly useful in biology, the data-based conception must be reconciled with the older form-based conception. We must understand the sense, if any, in which information shapes the organism. We must figure out how the abstract and symbolic becomes concrete and material. So in this case, I'm shaping a device, that is my mousetrap, or an organism, same difference. But this simultaneously involves a larger idea, how it is used, how it will be placed. A mouse coming, the mouse's need for cheese, his body vulnerability. So John is in many ways a preface to the subject of my Meditation on a Mousetrap article of 2012, in the Journal of Mind and Behavior. This was a contemplation of the surreptitious and illicit, or not so surreptitious, insertion of AI/computing into the problem of biological design, and completely ignoring the problem of common sense knowledge, unresolved, namely how to build mousetraps. John's comments on the Turing machine are certainly stepping into this. To quote, the DNA molecule, according to this picture, computes the organism, just as the Turing machine computes an algorithm or a mathematical function. But as we saw in last month's installment, mapping this abstract notion onto the complex biophysical processes of the DNA molecule requires a great deal of conceptual contortion. Remember our beginning slides with the 3D biological or structures, for example. We aren't really compensated for the effort with any genuine insights. the steps linking the DNA molecule with proteins, to say nothing of the steps linking it with higher level traits and behaviors, back to the behaviors again, are so multifaceted and context sensitive that the notion of computation remains only a vague placeholder for a future theory. And he'll state, to quote, "The ideal application of metaphor is in connecting a poorly understood topic with one that is much better understood. The information perspective is therefore a somewhat unsatisfactory metaphor because we don't fully understand it even in its home base, the arena of interpersonal communication, in its language. So it seems premature to use it as a lens with which to look at genetics or neuroscience. But it is the lens. This is the problem. And so again, we come to linguistic communication, and to why this will equally be our model or base for comprehending the curation of devices, or beings, or forms by the universe itself. To my statement, the shaping of a device simultaneously requires a larger idea. Now, Chomsky, inspired by Carl Lashley, formalized the concept of a linguistic sentence unfolding via a system of syntactic rules. Remember, we noticed syntax simply means rules for the spatial concatenation or juxtaposition of objects. Objects here being discrete symbols. And he viewed the sentence as unfolding via this set of syntactic rules, where the sentence unfolds firstly as a noun phrase and a verb phrase. The rewrite rule, S being rewritten as NP plus VP. A noun phrase is a determiner plus a noun, rewritten as that, like the is a determiner, etc. A noun we know, etc. So these rules unfolding. Lashley, I noted, would have been unimpressed. Why? What is S? Well, per Lashley, S is the atemporal idea. What's atemporal idea? Well, atemporal or contemporal, that is, the idea does not unfold normally in time. All the elements exist simultaneously. And a sentence then is a serially ordered, element-wise expression of this contemporal entity. So a sentence is the unfolding of this idea through the system of syntax rules. The man stirred the coffee, or the woman. Notice what else could have been expressed there. Tons of things. But the idea is infinitely richer than the expressed sentence. One must envision the idea expressing through syntactic mechanisms in the brain, but these will not be Chomskyan. But the idea is far richer. It could have been the man stirred the coffee with a giant spoon, with a giant cup, very slowly and effortlessly. Or the woman stirred the coffee slowly, absent-mindedly, looking out the window as she's doing. Just a note, remember the little phrase, waste makes haste. It's a spoonerism. It's inverted. Probably made famous via a phasic Professor Spooner. It's the example of idea expression through the syntactic structure failing. Then to note, this is the realm of Bergson's dynamic schemes, this S. To learn a dance, remember, the visual impression is an outline of the relations, especially temporal, but also spatial of the successive parts of the movement. This abstract image of the spatial temporal relations is the dynamic scheme. And the basic elements, walking, lifting up on the toes, swinging the arms, are ultimately coordinated into this scheme via this scheme. Such a scheme will apply to word production. Just, for example, saying the word understanding. All productions of words, all words are dynamic schemes. And to sentence production. That is, in the dynamic schemes, we are in the realm of S, the atemporal idea. All part of this vision of language understanding in Bergson. So, other than Bergson's, there's no theory of S, the idea. No computer or AI program has translated German to an atemporal idea and then to English. There cannot be such a theory of S because there's no theory of the perception of an event in the first place. So now I state this idea in this sense. I'll build a mousetrap like a crossbow. I'm transmitting information, quote unquote, on how to shape a device based in an analogical mapping, as I noted before, of a crossbow event to a mouse killing event. That is, inserting the components for the trap into the invariant structure of crossbow shooting. Incorporating how it is used, how it will be placed, a mouse's behavior. For example, we know this is not mouse's behavior. Trap isn't going to work. Or this. Or like this. So the mouse's need for cheese, his bodily vulnerability, all that's implied, sent. This whole knowledge is sent in this statement. I'll build a mousetrap like a crossbow. A larger idea, all comprising the larger idea, the atemporal idea. If this is what is underlying the information, quote unquote, for creating a simple device like a mousetrap, what underlies the information for creating a device, quote unquote, like a beetle, a wasp, or a spider? Again, the idea would comprise the environment for the behavior of this being. Again, remember the incredible complexity of the spider's web building process, all coordinate with the incredible complexity of his bodily architecture. And it is a complexity, yes, irreducible complexity, as Behe noted, a simultaneity that cannot be assembled element-wise over millions of years. Else the being, the spider, never functions. Just as the idea for the crossbow mousetrap is a simultaneity of complexly organized elements that all must be there. This was the deep subject of creative evolution. I've tried to picture it such as on the right over there, where you have the inextensive consciousness, the vital order, expressing as ultimately, in a diminished form, the world of matter, extended in its mathematical order, capable of being described roughly in limit by mathematics. Bergson's analog for the intensive idea was expressing ultimately in ordered form was Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, expressing this intensive idea of the Ninth Symphony, expressing ultimately in nice ordered form and notes. When taken to the creation of the vast complexity that is the I, there's an infinity of mechanisms, we get an even worse picture. As he said, nature has no more trouble in making an I than I have lifting my hand. Nature's simple act has divided itself automatically into an infinity of elements which are then found to be coordinated to one idea, just as the indivisible movement of my hand has dropped an infinity of points, which are then found to satisfy one equation. And he notes that life does not proceed by the association and addition of elements, but by dissociation and division. Just as S, the idea, is divided via syntactic rules into the elements of the sentence. Let me recur to the statement of John. The data-based conception must be reconciled with the older form-based conception. We must understand the sense of in which information shapes the organism. We must figure out how the abstract and symbolic becomes concrete and material. But this abstract is merely the expression of invariance over the concrete, over concrete experience. Coffee stirring is an abstraction. It is an invariance across the concrete experiences of coffee stirring in a memory model in 4D memory. It has abstract has no existence by itself. We will never, ever figure out what John is stating. That is how the abstract becomes the concrete, because the abstract does not exist by itself beyond, over and above the concrete. The statement misguides us with respect to the problem. It is a misstatement, a misconception based in the computer metaphor, which only employs abstract symbols. Rather, you must understand what the abstract symbolic actually is. That is invariance across the concrete, defined across the concrete, which starts a whole different path to solution of the problem. Abstract has no existence by itself. I realize we have shifted here momentarily to evolution's creation of beings and away from the developmental genetics problem with which we and Jacob Johns started. But the same general schema and problem is going to hold. The architecture of the brain allows the idea, S, to unfold, syntactically structured, divided into elements, the words. The architecture of DNA, one can ask, is it an analog? That is, it is a structure, highly flexible, to express the idea, all that involves of the organism. Yes, there is definitely some relation here to Sheldrake and his morphic fields, but to be frank, Sheldrake's thought is a small subset of Bergson. We need to place Sheldrake within Bergson's framework, not vice versa. So concluding, yes, the thought road to work this out is going to be hard, long and hard. Here we are in an entirely different metaphysic of space and time, thus of consciousness and matter. With Bergson, this is where the metaphor of information, as based in linguistic communication, leads us. Perhaps when neuroscience and developmental biology finally sense they have reached a dead end, they'll start that road. Next, we'll see. Till then, signing off.